Today's headline is Newton's Big Killing, an event in the early days of a tough Kansas town. The subheadline says, "For months it was a battle between cowboys and those who preyed on them. The Big Killing was the culmination, then the town reformed." This article originally came from Great Bend, Kansas on October 6th. "The toughest, cussedest Wild West town I ever knew," said Buffalo Bill once, "was Newton, Kansas, as it was in the early 70s. Dodge City and Macon Junction used to figure in the newspapers as the typical tough towns on the border, but Newton could give them cards and spades on wholesale depravity and recklessness. Newton today is wide awake, enterprising, and peaceable, and the citizens know only of tradition of the scenes of blood of the early days. It is a handsome opera house, costly and imposing county buildings, hundreds of pretty homes, wide avenues of residences, long commercial streets, and prosperous wholesale and manufacturing concerns. In the spring of 1871, the terminus of the Santa Fe Railroad was at Emporia. It was determined to build to a point 75 miles further west. The object was to catch the Texas cattle trade. Two men went and camped on the spot in April 1871. There was not a foot of lumber then in what is now Harvey County, Kansas. These men were the pioneers of the town that Captain John Sebastian afterward named Newton. 6 weeks later, there was a population of nearly 2,000. The history of the town for the first 8 months is a story of lawlessness and bloodshed that has probably never been equaled on this continent, although other places, mining camps and cattle towns have kept up the music of the pistol a greater length of time. As soon as it became known that Newton was to be the end of the railroad for a year and that it was to be a cattle shipping point, whiskey sellers, gamblers, and thieves flocked there by hundreds. Of course, many respectable men seeking a legitimate business went there too, but the object of the majority of the newcomers was to rob the cowboys and cattlemen. For months, it was a never-ending battle between these lawbreakers on the one side and the men who knew no law on the other. From first to last, 36 persons were killed with their boots on. At least a dozen gambling houses were run on the main street, and the doors were kept open day and night, including Sunday. One of them, the Gold Room, was capable of holding 500 or 600 people. Every known kind of gambling was practiced. A scene occurred in this place one Sunday night that is not often witnessed. A Methodist preacher went to the boss of the place, Doc Fair, and requested permission to hold divine service. It was granted, and with every gambling table running and the bar sending out its liquid hell, the preacher, the Reverend Mr. Hahn, stood up and told the story of the man of Nazareth. Before he had finished his sermon, a quarrel arose at one of the card tables and a man was shot. It is not intended to give a detailed account of the murders. If a gang of cowboys rode into town, the smallest provocation would set their guns going, and going to kill. A bond election was held. Several special constables were appointed for election day. One of them was a Texan named Martin. At the polls, there was a quarrel between him and a big Irishman who called himself McCluskey, but whose real name was Arthur Delaney. The result of that quarrel was the death of 8 men and 1 woman, and the wounding of an equal number. After the election was over, McCluskey and Martin met in the Lone Star Saloon and renewed the quarrel. A proposition was made and accepted to go out on the street and settle it with the fist. Both men laid off their belts and started for the street. Martin had a gun hidden in his boot, and just as the door was reached, he went down after it, intending to kill the Irishman. McCluskey was too quick for him, and taking the gun away from Martin, shot him dead. McCluskey gave himself up and was acquitted. Martin had a host of friends, and they vowed vengeance on his slayer. His death led to what has always been known as the Big Killing in Newton. There were free dance halls across the railroad track in what was known as Hyde Park. In one of them, the Big Killing occurred. McCluskey was a hanger-on at one of them. Martin's friends swore they would kill him and all who took his part. The engagement took place according to the program. McCluskey was killed early in the fray. He had 2 holes through his neck, and enough lead was scattered about through his body to make anyone who discovers his grave imagine that he had struck a paying lead mine. A man on the McCluskey side shot 9 of the Longhorn crowd, and did it in a novel way. Knowing that the fight would occur, this man, Riley by name, went prepared to make himself felt. He had 4 6-shooters on him. At the first pop of a gun, he deliberately walked up to a Texan and shot him in the eye. Then, running his two arms between the arms and body of the dead man, he made a human barricade and shot at will from a safe ambush. After the fight, he went out, mounted a horse, and left. The dead at the big killing were speedily disposed of and the wounded taken care of. Mike Fitzpatrick kept a dive that he called a sidetrack. The unlucky fellow who got in there found himself sidetracked until his money was gone. Some of the decent people were bold enough to protest against his robberies, among others, a prominent merchant. Mike did not like any interference in his business, and one morning he primed himself with more of his vile whiskey than usual and started out to kill. The merchant was sought, but he happened to be out of his store. Mike went up the street, friending everybody, and walked into a saloon. There he saw the city's police judge, George Halliday, and without the slightest provocation or warning, he shot him through the heart. The marshal, Jack Johnson, had been advised that Mike was on a raid and started to capture him. Seeing Mike coming out of the saloon, Johnson rested his Winchester rifle on the well curb and shot him down. This was Noon's last killing. An hour afterward, the citizens had formed a league, and the suspicious characters were notified to leave. They left. Tom Carson, a nephew of old Kit Carson, was sent for at one time and came to take the marshalship of the town. He stayed 3 weeks. The toughs had it in for him, and to save his life, he skipped. Wild Bill, J.B. Hickok, tried to be marshal. He couldn't do it. Marshal King was killed in the discharge of his duties. This story came from the great state of New York, being reported in the Sun of October 14th, 1894. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, now remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we'll see you next time on Americana Archives.